Imagine this. You are lying in a narrow, straw-filled bed in the year 1347. The scent of smoke on the hearth mixes with the sour tang of unwashed wool, and you are feverish, your body aching with something you do not understand. A doctor arrives, not in a crisp white coat, but in a rough woolen robe, carrying a pouch of dried herbs, a small knife, and something that makes your stomach turn, a handful of wriggling worms. Yes, in the medieval world, worms were not just pests. They were medicine. To us, it seems absurd. But to a physician trained in the traditions of Galen and Hippocrates, prescribing worms, earthworms, to be precise, made perfect sense. According to medical texts of the time, earthworms could be ground into paste to treat wounds, boiled into broths to restore vitality, and even dried into powder for use in strange concoctions. Their slimy texture and regenerative nature were thought to carry healing properties, a belief woven into the philosophy of medieval natural medicine. Medieval doctors lived in a world where medicine was guided less by microscopes and more by metaphor. The humoral theory, the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated the medical imagination. Illness was thought to arise when these fluids fell out of balance. Treatments, therefore, had to restore harmony, not by targeting pathogens, which no one knew existed, but by adjusting qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry. Worms were considered moist and earthy, making them suitable for conditions that were dry or excessively hot. For example, a patient with fevers or a parched cough might be prescribed a concoction containing worms to cool and moisten the imbalance. It wasn't just theory. Worms, after being boiled, produce an oily residue that medieval doctors described as healing to the skin. Applied to ulcers, sores, or inflamed joints, this slimy essence was believed to draw out poisons and restore balance. One preserved recipe from a 12th century medical text instructs a physician to take earthworms, wash them well in wine, pound them with salt, and lay them upon the wound to heal corruption. Another advises boiling worms in oil, straining the liquid, and applying to aching joints, particularly in cases of gout or arthritis. Worms even made their way into potions for epilepsy, convulsions, and fevers. Some physicians recommended drying worms to a powder, then mixing them with honey or vinegar. To the medieval mind, the regenerative quality of worms, that they seemed to survive when cut in half, hinted at mystical powers of renewal that could be transferred to the human body. But what did this look like in practice? Imagine the patient once more, lying in a smoky, dimly lit room. The physician would prepare his worm-based remedy on the spot. Earthworms might be gathered from the garden that morning, rinsed in wine to purify them, and then placed directly onto an infected wound. You can almost hear the squirm of the creatures against the skin, the hush of the doctor's voice as he explains that the worms are drawing out the poison. Whether it worked or not, the ritual itself, the sensation, the belief, was often enough to reassure the patient, and in an age where options were limited, that reassurance mattered. The logic of worm medicine was not entirely baseless. Earthworms contain proteins and coalomic fluid with natural antibacterial properties. Modern science has found that earthworm extract does indeed have wound-healing effects. Of course, medieval doctors had no microscopes to prove this. They relied instead on centuries of oral tradition and observation. But the faint glimmer of truth within their strange practices explains why such remedies endured for centuries. Worms also had a symbolic value. They lived underground in the moist earth, close to rotten decay, but from this decay, they produced fertile soil. To a medieval doctor steeped in the symbolism of nature, worms embodied death transformed into life. They were, in their own way, creatures of healing. And yet, the question lingers, how far did this belief go? Were worms truly trusted as medicine for the gravest illnesses, or were they simply one remedy among many in a chaotic toolbox of medieval cures? You've seen how worms were ground, boiled, and applied in the smoky quiet of a medieval sickroom. But to really understand their place in history, you have to zoom out. Worms weren't an isolated curiosity. They lived in the same medicine chest as leeches, pigeon dung, powdered gemstones, and even human body parts. To us, the medieval pharmacy looks like a cabinet of horrors. To the people of the time, it was an arsenal of survival. The medieval physician was not a scientist in the modern sense. He was a curator of tradition, weaving together Greek theory, Roman practice, Arabic scholarship, and folk remedies passed down through villages. Texts like the Tequinum Sanitatis and the works of Avicenna provided guidelines for balancing humors, while local healers contributed recipes gathered through trial and error. And so the medical kit contained everything that could be classified into qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. Leeches, for reducing excess blood, thought to cool the overheated body. Bloodletting knives, to rebalance the humors directly. Herbs, chamomile, sage, fennel, and wormwood, ironically not worms but bitter plants, to purge the stomach or calm the nerves. Animal parts, fat of bears, milk of asses, bile of oxen, ground antlers. Minerals, sulfur, mercury, and salt, often combined into salves. In this mix, worms were simply another substance, another texture, another symbol. They sat comfortably among other strange ingredients, because the line between medicine and magic was porous. If you flip through the yellowed pages of manuscripts, you'll find worms mentioned again and again. In the Leech Book of Bald, an Anglo-Saxon medical text dating to the 10th century, worms are used in remedies for wounds, boils, and fevers. Later collections from the 13th and 14th centuries repeat and expand these recipes. One such instruction reads, "Take earthworms, cleanse them in vinegar, dry them in the sun, and grind them into a fine powder. Give to the patient with ale against the stone of the bladder." This stone was kidney or bladder stones, a painful affliction with no effective cure. The powdered worm was thought to dissolve the stone, or at least soothe the agony. Worms were also applied as poultices for eyes, mixed with honey to reduce swelling or infection. The slimy quality of the worm echoed the wetness of the eye, and so it was believed to be sympathetic medicine, like heals like. Now, picture the difference between a university-trained physician in Paris and a village healer in the English countryside. Both might prescribe worms, but for different reasons. The physician, quoting Galen, might explain that worms restore the body's earthly balance. The village healer might tell you that worms have been seen to crawl into the wounds of animals and draw out corruption. So why not humans? In both cases, the authority came not from proof but from repetition. If enough people had seen or heard of worms working, the remedy gained weight, and if the patient believed, half the cure was already in motion. It's easy to dismiss medieval medicine as superstition, but consider this. In an age before antibiotics, belief was often as powerful as treatment. Placebo effect, ritual, and trust in the healer could calm the mind and ease the body. A patient who swallowed a powder of dried worms might not be cured of kidney stones, but the ritual gave them hope. The healer's words, the taste of the concoction, the act of doing something, these created a psychological anchor. And sometimes worms did help, though for reasons unknown to the people of the time. Earthworm secretions contain lumbrokinase, an enzyme with blood-thinning properties. In small ways, the medicine may have touched the ailment, the body might heal itself, and the worms would receive the credit. Medicine was not confined to the sick room. It was also an economy. In crowded medieval markets, you could buy worms preserved in wine, alongside jars of leeches and packets of dried herbs. Apothecaries stocked these goods like spices. Worms were easy to collect, cheap to prepare, and endlessly renewable. Farmers and children might sell them to apothecaries for a few coins. Unlike gemstones or exotic spices, worms were humble, local, and accessible. This availability made them a staple, part of the ordinary rhythm of healthcare. So why are leeches remembered while worms are forgotten? The answer lies in spectacle. Leeches were dramatic. You place them on the skin and blood poured out. The patient saw and felt the treatment immediately. Worms, in contrast, were subtle, their work hidden inside poultices or powders. Yet in many regions, worms were used as frequently as leeches. The two creatures often shared the same jars in the apothecary's stall, waiting to be deployed in the endless battle against imbalance. Still, there were boundaries. No one expected worms to cure the plague or smallpox. They were remedies for the middle ground of illness: aches, wounds, fevers, swellings. For great diseases, doctors turned to bloodletting, pilgrimages, or desperate prayers. Worms were for the ordinary ailments of daily survival. But this raises a larger question. What did people think was happening inside the body when they swallowed or applied worms? To the medieval mind, medicine was never just practical. It was spiritual, symbolic, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature. Worms, in particular, carried a double meaning. They were creatures of decay, yet they turned decay into life. If you buried a body, or even scraps of food, in the earth, worms would appear. They were the attendants of death, breaking down flesh, reminding the living of mortality. To prescribe worms, then, was to invite the patient to confront death directly. But worms also restored the soil, making it fertile. In that sense, they symbolize renewal. Doctors and priests alike often blurred the boundary between the medical and the moral. A worm poultice was not just a cure, it was a lesson. It said, "You are dust, and from dust comes life again." Healing was a reminder of God's cycle of death and resurrection, written into the smallest creatures of the earth. It is no accident that worms appear in sermons as well as in recipes. Medieval preachers often warned their congregations that the grave was full of worms, a humbling image of corruption awaiting every human body. To survive illness through the aid of worms was, in some ways, a small rehearsal of that larger truth. In monasteries, where much of medical knowledge was copied and preserved, monks saw no contradiction in using worms for healing. Scripture described humans as frail, corruptible, even worm-like themselves. If God placed healing power in his creation, even in something as lowly as a worm, then to use it was an act of faith, not folly. By the late Renaissance, however, the worm was beginning to lose its medical standing. As anatomical studies advanced and chemical remedies gained traction, the symbolic weight of worms gave way to skepticism. The rise of Paracelsian medicine emphasized minerals, distillations, and alchemy. Worms, humble and local, seemed too primitive for the new age of experimentation. Dissections and observations revealed that the body's workings were not explained by humors alone. The symbolic wetness of worms lost its meaning. Global trade brought exotic ingredients, quinine, tobacco, opium, that dazzled physicians and pushed aside older folk remedies. By the 18th century, worm medicine survived only in rural traditions, fading from the manuals of serious physicians. And yet, history has a way of looping back. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scientists began to study earthworms again, not as humoral bouncers, but as biochemical factories. Extracts from worms showed antimicrobial and clot-dissolving properties. In laboratories, their enzymes have been tested for wound healing, much as monks once claimed in their manuscripts. Of course, no doctor today will hand you a worm poultice for arthritis. But the medieval instinct that nature hides cures in unexpected places was not entirely misguided. Now imagine again the patient in the smoky cottage. Feverish, afraid, they lie still as the healer places a cool poultice of wine-soaked worms on their skin. The sensation is odd, perhaps even repulsive, but the patient closes their eyes. They believe the poison is being drawn out. They believe healing has begun. That belief, combined with rest, warmth, and time, might be enough. Sometimes the patient recovers. Sometimes they don't. But the worm has done its work, not only on the wound, but on the mind. Worm medicine may seem absurd to us, but it reveals a truth about history, that healing is not only about science, but about meaning. Medieval doctors prescribed worms because they saw in them a bridge between life and death, corruption and renewal. They carried the symbolism of the grave and the promise of the soil. And perhaps that is why the practice endured for centuries. Not because worms were the most effective cure, but because they embodied the way people understood their world. So the next time you see a worm wriggling in the earth after a rainstorm, remember, in another age, it was not just a humble creature of the soil. It was medicine mystery, and a reminder that even the smallest things can shape the great story of survival. Imagine yourself in a medieval home. The fire flickers, straw rustles underfoot, and the night stretches long. There is no bathroom to excuse yourself to, no flush, no tile convenience. Instead, under the bed, behind a curtain, or discreetly tucked into a corner sits the most humble but essential of objects, the chamber pot. For centuries, long before modern plumbing, the chamber pot was a backbone of private sanitation. Everyone used it. Kings in their castles, peasants in their huts, monks in their cloisters. Its role was not glamorous, and its mention was rarely polite, but without it, daily life would have been unbearable. The chamber pot was, at its core, a bowl or vessel, often made of ceramic, metal, or wood. It was small enough to keep near the bed, but large enough to serve its purpose. Some were plain and practical, others decorated with glaze, heraldry, or even humor. At night, when the streets were dangerous and dark, you did not venture outside to relieve yourself. You reached for the pot instead. During illness, when a patient could not rise, the pot was a lifeline. For women in childbirth, for children afraid of the dark, for travelers staying in inns. It was a necessity no household could do without. We often imagine history through great inventions and wars, but the chamber pot tells a quieter truth. Survival is in the details. The universality of the chamber pot is striking. Kings and queens had attendants known as grooms of the stool, whose duty was to manage the royal pot, assist with its use, and even advise on a monarch's health by observing the contents. Far from being a degrading role, it was one of intimacy and influence. Proximity to the king meant access to his ear. Monks and nuns shared communal pots in cloisters, carefully regulated by rules of silence and cleanliness. In some monasteries, pits were dug beneath cloisters where pots could be emptied, early precursors to latrines. Peasants used simple clay vessels, often indistinguishable from cooking pots except for their purpose. These might be emptied into the street, the garden, or a cesspit. The pot was not a symbol of poverty or wealth. It was a universal object, bridging the gulf between rich and poor. What happened after the pot was used is where the story gets more vivid. In many towns, especially during the Middle Ages, the contents of the chamber pot were tossed directly into the street. Narrow lanes without sewers became open channels of waste. In some cities, people were expected to shout warnings, "Guard the loo" in Edinburgh, "Mind the water" in London, before throwing the contents out of a window. Those who failed to shout might find themselves fined, or worse, confronted by angry neighbors. The smell of medieval streets was notorious, a mixture of animals' refuse and human waste. To walk through a city was to dodge puddles, cover your nose, and pray for a breeze. The chamber pot was at the center of this cycle, a personal object that contributed to a collective problem. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the chamber pot had become more refined. Wealthy households kept them inside cabinets, disguised as part of the furniture. Close stools, as they were called, looked like ordinary wooden chairs but contained a hidden pot beneath the seat. Upholstered for comfort, these chairs allowed privacy and dignity in an age before plumbing. In France, these were sometimes ornately carved, with velvet seats and gilded handles. The contrast was striking, objects of beauty designed for the least beautiful of functions. Even in ordinary homes, the pot was rarely left in the open. It might be tucked under bed or behind a screen. Its presence was acknowledged but seldom discussed. Despite their universality, chamber pots carried a social awkwardness. To mention them openly was impolite, yet humor thrived in the shadows of necessity. Some pots were decorated with faces, political caricatures, or satirical messages painted at the bottom, revealed only after use. To relieve oneself in the likeness of an unpopular figure was a small act of rebellion. Still, the chamber pot was also tied to shame. Emptying it was often the task of servants or younger family members, a reminder of hierarchy within the household. For children, the pot was a training ground before graduating to more adult habits of disposal. Picture it. The medieval night, candles guttering, silence heavy. You stir awake, the air cold against your skin. Rising from bed, you reach for the pot. The floor creaks, the ceramic cool to the touch. This simple ritual, repeated for centuries across countless households, was part of the rhythm of life. And yet, the question remains, what did people do when the pot was full, when the streets overflowed, and when entire cities began to choke on their own waste? If the chamber pot was the immediate solution, the bigger question was always the same. Where does it all go? For centuries, households lived in a cycle of filling and emptying. Each pot had to be disposed of, and each family had to find a way. What began as a personal convenience often became a collective problem. In small villages, disposal was relatively simple. Waste in the chamber pot could be emptied into fields, where it mixed with animal dung and eventually fertilized crops. While not hygienic by modern standards, it was a cycle the earth could absorb. But in cities, the scale was overwhelming. Narrow lanes, crowded houses, and the absence of planned sewers turned disposal into chaos. Pots were emptied into open ditches running along the streets. Streams and rivers, which carried the waste away, but foul drinking water. Designated pits, dug behind houses, though these often overflowed. The result was a constant tension between convenience and contamination. To live in a medieval or early modern city was to live with the stench of your neighbors. One of the earliest organized solutions was a cesspit, a dugout hole lined with stone or brick where household waste could be dumped. Cesspits were often shared by multiple houses, tucked into backyards or alleys. When they filled up, someone had to clean them. Enter one of the least envied professions of history, the gong farmer. The gong farmer's job was to descend into the cesspit, shovel out the waste, and cart away. Usually, this happened at night, when the stench would disturb fewer people. It was dangerous work. Cesspits would collapse, gases could suffocate, and diseases spread easily. Yet the job paid surprisingly well. Few others were willing to do it. The waste was often taken outside city walls and sold as fertilizer to farmers, continuing the long cycle of human waste nourishing crops. The chamber pot, emptied into the pit, eventually returned to the table in the form of bread or vegetables. For many cities, rivers became the default sewer system. In London, Paris, and countless other towns, chamber pots were emptied directly into the Thames, the Seine, or smaller tributaries. The logic was simple. The current would carry it away. But rivers also supplied drinking water. In London, the same river that swallowed chamber pots also filled jugs at water carrier stalls. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were inevitable, though their causes remained mysterious until the 19th century. Medieval texts often complained of the smell of rivers choked with waste. In 14th century Paris, authorities tried repeatedly to ban dumping in the Seine, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The chamber pot was a private object. The river was a public convenience. The two remained tied together for centuries. By the late Middle Ages, cities began to issue ordinances. People were fined for emptying chamber pots directly into the street without warning. In some towns, fines were doubled if the waste struck someone walking below. In Edinburgh, the cry of Gardaloo was meant to spare pedestrians from a rude baptism, but accidents were frequent. Cesspits were regulated too, required to be lined, placed at certain distances from wells, or cleaned at intervals. Yet corruption, neglect, and sheer population growth made enforcement patchy. The pot itself never disappeared. It simply fed into larger systems of control, imperfect as they were. In wealthier households, the task of emptying pots fell to servants. For a maid or footman, carrying the pot to a cesspit or dumping ground was part of the daily rhythm. Manuals of household management even gave instructions on how to do so discreetly and without offense. For royalty, entire staff positions revolved around managing waste. The groom of the stool in Tudor England did not just handle the king's chamber pot. He was trusted with private counsel, making the role one of unexpected political influence. To be close to a monarch's most private moments was to be close to his secrets. The chamber pot, then, was never just about sanitation. It was about hierarchy, intimacy, and power. By the 17th and 18th centuries, growing cities began to feel the strain. London's cesspits overflowed, contaminating wells. In Paris, inspectors noted that cesspools were leaking into cellars. The connection between waste and disease was not yet fully understood, but the discomfort was impossible to ignore. The chamber pot itself remained unchanged, still a bowl under the bed, but the world around was groaning under the weight of its consequences. And so the question emerged, could there be a better way? Could human waste be managed on a larger, more organized scale, without relying solely on the pot in the pit? For centuries, the chamber pot reigned supreme. It was cheap, simple, and portable, qualities that no early alternative could beat. Even as cesspits deepened and cities experimented with rudimentary sewer systems, the household chamber pot remained unchanged. Why? Because it worked. A vessel under the bed, emptied at convenience, was practical in a world where water did not flow freely into homes. In castles, cottages, and taverns alike, the pot was a small island of privacy in a world with few such comforts. But by the 18th century, pressures were mounting. Populations were growing. Cities stank. Wells ran foul. The question was no longer whether the chamber pot was convenient, but whether society could survive if it remained the only solution. The idea of a flushing toilet is older than you might think. In 1596, Sir John Harington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, designed a contraption he called the Ajax. It used a system of water to flush waste away, a direct ancestor of the modern toilet. But Harrington's design was expensive, prone to leaks, and lacked proper sewers to carry the waste far enough. The Queen herself reportedly used one, but the idea never spread. The chamber pot remained more practical. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, inventors tinkered. Wooden seats with valves, water traps, and new systems appeared. Yet, without large-scale sewer systems, flushing toilets were curiosities for the rich. For everyone else, the pot endured. Even in cities that dug sewers, most were designed to carry away rainwater, not human waste. Adding chamber pot's contents into these channels only worsened flooding and foul smells. In London, the great sewer system of the 17th century was often overwhelmed, and cesspits remained common. In Paris, a similar story unfolded. Waste overflowed into the Seine, and despite endless ordinances, the chamber pot kept feeding the river. It would take the crises of the 19th century, the cholera epidemics, and the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames itself reeked so badly Parliament could not sit, to finally force investment in proper sewers. Meanwhile, the chamber pot evolved in style. By the 18th century, close stools and commodes became standard in wealthy homes. These were elegant wooden chairs with hidden pots inside, upholstered for comfort. Some were even portable, with handles and lids. For royalty, chamber pots could be works of art. Porcelain painted with gilded edges, lids that fit snugly, even silken coverings. What had once been a humble bowl now had a place in elite craftsmanship, but functionally, they were unchanged. They still needed to be emptied, still required servants or family members to carry away the contents, and still fed into the same cesspits and rivers. By the mid-19th century, as waterworks expanded and proper sewer systems took shape, the chamber pot began its slow retreat. Flushing toilets, once rare, became more common in urban houses. Yet the chamber pot did not vanish overnight. In rural areas, where plumbing lagged behind, pots remained a nightly companion well into the 20th century. In fact, in some households, particularly in poorer or remote regions, chamber pots were used into the 1950s and 1960s. Children in those decades still remember the potty in a bed or the enamel pot tucked away in a washstand. Hotels kept them in rooms for guests who didn't want to trek down corridors at night. The endurance of the chamber pot reminds us, even when technology advances, old habits linger. The chamber pot is rarely remembered in history. We prefer to talk about castles, battles, or inventions of grandeur. But the pot reminds us of a different kind of survival, the everyday, unglamorous struggle of managing the body. It shaped architecture, rooms designed to conceal it, pits dug to receive it, rivers choked by its contents. It shaped labor, servants tasked with emptying it, farmers fertilizing fields with its remnants. It shaped society, the intimacy of grooms of the stool, the humiliation of servants, the cries of Gardaloo in crowded streets. For centuries, the chamber pot was as essential to life as bread or fire, and though the flush toilet finally displaced it, its quiet reign lasted far longer than most of the inventions we celebrate today. So tonight, as you imagine drifting into sleep, think of the chamber pot tucked quietly beneath countless beds across history. A simple vessel, humble and unremarkable, but one that carried the weight of civilization's most basic need. Without it, daily life would have been impossible. With it, humanity endured. Picture a medieval village in the depth of winter. Snow lingers on the thatched roofs, and the air carries the smell of wood smoke and damp wool. The harvest from a previous summer is long gone, stored in wooden bins or stone granaries. Families rely on bread, the staple that holds their lives together. But as the dough is kneaded and the loaves are baked, something invisible lurks within the flour. By nightfall, the village will begin to notice it. Fingers twitching, feet burning, visions of fire and demons dancing in the mind. By dawn, some will writhe in convulsions, others will lose fingers or toes to black and rot, and still others will wander in madness. The culprit? Not a curse, not a demon, but a fungus, ergot, the parasite of rye. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that infects the seed heads of rye and other grains. Instead of golden kernels, it produces hard, dark, curved structures called sclerotia. To the farmer's eye, they resemble burnt grains or shriveled husks, easily overlooked in a poor harvest. Ground into flour, they vanish into the mix, leaving no obvious trace. Yet their toxins are potent. Ergot alkaloids constrict blood vessels, cause hallucinations, and attack the nervous system. In large amounts, they are deadly. To medieval communities, however, ergot had no name. Its effects were understood only through the suffering it caused. Bread, the symbol of life, became the agent of death. Historical accounts describe ergotism in two distinct forms. Convulsive ergotism. Victims suffered seizures, spasms, crawling sensations under the skin, hallucinations, and madness. They raved of visions, angels, demons, flames consuming their bodies. Some believed they had been bewitched. Gangrenous ergotism. Blood flow to the limbs was cut off. Fingers, toes, and even whole limbs turned black and fell away. Victims endured a slow decay, their flesh rotting while they still lived. In both cases, the suffering was immense. Whole villages might be struck at once, the bread of one season poisoning hundreds. Medieval chroniclers often call these outbreaks St. Anthony's fire. The name came from the burning sensations victims felt in their limbs. Skin flushed red, pain spread like flame, and people cried out as though consumed by invisible fire. Hospitals run by the Order of St. Anthony sprang up across Europe to care for sufferers. Monks in these hospitals became known for their black robes and the blue cross of their order. They offered herbs, prayers, and a safer diet, wheat bread, wine, and meat, which spared patients from the poison rye of their villages. Though the monks did not know the cause, their treatment often worked, simply because it removed ergot from the diet. Those who left rye behind sometimes recovered. Why rye? The grain was hardy, thriving in poor soils and cold climates where wheat would fail. For peasants in northern Europe, rye was often the only reliable crop. But rye was also particularly vulnerable to ergot. During wet summers, when the fungus flourished, whole harvests could be tainted. In times of famine, no one could afford to throw away grain. Even if the kernels looked suspicious, they were milled, baked, and eaten. Hunger left no choice. Thus, the very grain that sustained the poor also betrayed them. The wealthier classes who ate more wheat were less affected, widening the gulf of suffering. Lacking knowledge of fungi or toxins, medieval people explained ergotism through the frameworks they had. Spiritual punishment. Outbreaks were seen as the wrath of God, a punishment for sin. Processions, prayers, and pilgrimages followed outbreaks, with whole towns seeking absolution. Witchcraft and demons. The convulsions and hallucinations of victims fed beliefs in witchcraft. Screams of possession, visions of devils, and uncontrollable fits were interpreted as diabolical influence. Astrology. Some physicians blamed the stars, suggesting planetary alignments had corrupted the harvest. Each explanation carried weight, but none touched the true culprit hiding in the rye fields. What makes ergotism especially haunting is that it was not a one-time disaster. It returned again and again, across centuries, a shadow that haunted the breadbasket of Europe. From the 9th century to the 18th, chronicles record outbreaks where thousands perished or were maimed. Imagine the terror. To eat the bread that sustained your family, knowing it might also destroy them. Yet hunger was relentless, and the loaf was all there was. And so the question lingers, how did communities endure this recurring curse? Did they ever suspect the bread itself, or was the true cause hidden for nearly 1,000 years? The earliest clear description of ergotism dates back to the year 857 in the Rhine Valley. Chroniclers wrote of a great plague of swollen blisters that consumed the people with a fiery corruption. Entire villages were struck. Victims screamed of burning pain, their limbs blackened, and many perished within days. From that point on, outbreaks became a grim rhythm in European history. France was especially hard hit, with records of tens of thousands dying in single epidemics. The symptoms were so distinct, burning limbs, spasm, hallucinations, that they became etched into cultural memory as St. Anthony's fire. By the 11th century, the Order of St. Anthony established hospitals across France and beyond. Pilgrims suffering from ergotism flocked to these institutions, where monks gave them wheat bread, wine, and meat, foods that unknowingly removed ergot from their diets. The monks became associated with miraculous healing, and their black habits with the blue cross became a familiar sight. Over time, they were seen as specialists in treating the holy fire. Though they lacked any scientific understanding, their interventions saved countless lives. Their hospitals were not just medical centers, but also spiritual refuges. Processions, relics, and prayers accompanied the physical care, reinforcing the belief that recovery was as much divine as it was practical. While ergotism often brought spasms and gangrene, one outbreak in Strasbourg took a stranger form, the infamous dancing plague of 1518. Dozens of people began dancing uncontrollably in the streets, unable to stop for days. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others reportedly danced themselves to death. Historians have long debated the cause: mass hysteria, religious mania, or perhaps the hallucinatory effects of ergot-tainted bread. Though the exact link is uncertain, the parallels between ergot's convulsive form and the frenzied movement of the dancers are hard to ignore. For those who witnessed it, the plague seemed like possession, the city overtaken by madness. The symptoms of convulsive ergotism, visions, voices, uncontrollable fits, also fed into Europe's witch trials. In regions where outbreaks occurred, accusations of sorcery often spiked. Consider Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692. Though separated from Europe by centuries in an ocean, the afflicted girls of Salem described sensations strikingly similar to ergot poisoning: prickling skin, hallucinations, contortions. Some scholars have argued that a contaminated rye harvest may have played a role in the hysteria that led to the infamous witch trials. Whether in Europe or the New World, the line between natural poisoning and supernatural fear was blurred. The bread of life became the bread of suspicion. For peasants, outbreaks meant terror, but also resignation. Famine left no alternative. Even suspicious-looking kernels were milled into flour, because hunger was worse than risk. Chroniclers describe people making the sign of the cross over their loaves, praying for protection as they ate. Families sometimes baked smaller portions, hoping to spread the danger thin. Others tried soaking the grain or adding herbs, but the fungus clung tight. And yet, despite the suffering, ergotism never eradicated entire regions. Communities endured. Children grew up, harvests improved, and the memory of the fire lived on in warnings and tales. What's most remarkable is how long the true cause remained hidden. For nearly 1,000 years, no one suspected the blackened grains. Physicians debated humors. Priests warned of sin. Villagers whispered of curses. But the fungus passed unnoticed in every loaf. The connection between ergot and its symptoms would only be fully established in the 19th century. Until then, Europe lived in cycles of invisible poisoning, haunted by an enemy they never named. And so the question emerges: when the cause was finally discovered, how did science unravel the mystery? And what unexpected legacies did ergot leave behind in medicine and history? For centuries, ergotism remained an unsolved riddle. The outbreaks were too unpredictable, the symptoms too varied, and the cause too well hidden inside the daily staple of bread. It was not until the 18th and 19th centuries that scientists began to connect the dots. In 1676, a French physician named Denis Dodart observed that ergot-infected rye grains were linked to outbreaks of gangrene. He published his suspicions, but the idea did not immediately take hold. Farmers continued to mill infected rye, and doctors continued to debate spiritual and humoral causes. By the late 19th century, researchers finally confirmed what Dodart had suspected. Ergot was the culprit. Under the microscope, they could see the dark, horn-shaped sclerotia and isolate the alkaloid within. The mystery of St. Anthony's fire was solved, centuries after its flames first consumed Europe. Ironically, once ergot was understood, it became not just a poison to be feared, but a resource to be harnessed. Its alkaloids, though deadly in large doses, had powerful effects in controlled amounts. Obstetrics. Ergot derivatives were used to contract the uterus and stop bleeding after childbirth, saving lives that might otherwise be lost. Cardiology. Its ability to constrict blood vessels was studied for circulatory diseases. Neurology. Some derivatives were tested as treatments for migraines. The very substance that once blackened limbs and drove people mad became a cornerstone of medical research. The story of ergot doesn't end with medicine. In 1938, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann synthesized a compound derived from ergot alkaloids, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. Though his goal was to develop a circulatory stimulant, Hofmann accidentally discovered LSD's hallucinogenic properties in 1943. The visions, distortions, and sensations of his famous bicycle ride echoed the same symptoms that had haunted medieval villagers centuries before. Thus, the fungus that gave birth to St. Anthony's fire also sparked one of the most controversial cultural revolutions of the 20th century. From monasteries to counterculture, ergot's legacy stretched farther than anyone could have imagined. Looking back, historians have speculated on ergot's role in shaping major events. Did tainted bread contribute to the paranoia of witch trials? Did outbreaks weaken armies or influence political decisions? While direct proof is scarce, the possibility lingers. In a world where bread was life, a poison harvest could ripple through society in unseen ways. The fungus was silent, but its influence may have whispered through history. Today, ergotism has all but vanished in developed nations. Rigorous grain inspection, modern storage methods, and chemical treatments keep ergot out of the food supply. Outbreaks still occur occasionally in regions with less control, but they are rare and quickly identified. And yet, the memory of the holy fire lingers in historical texts, in the records of monasteries, and in the bones of those who lost fingers, toes, or limbs to blackened rot. The story of ergot is not just about disease. It is about the fragility of human survival when daily sustenance turns against you. For the peasant eating rye bread in a cold hut, there was no warning label, no microscope, no scientist to explain. There was only hunger and the loaf in hand. Bread could nourish or to kill, and in that grim uncertainty lies a lesson about history, that the smallest of things, a fungus hidden in a kernel of grain, can shape the destiny of nations, feed myths of witchcraft, and alter the course of medicine and culture. The next time you slice into a loaf of bread, think of those villagers centuries ago. To them, bread was life itself, and yet within it lurked death. The mystery endured for 1,000 years, its flames called holy, its victims abandoned to fate. Only later did we learn the truth, that survival can hinge on something as small, as invisible as a fungus in the fields. Imagine living in England in the late 17th century. The sun has set, the hearth glows faintly, and the world plunges into darkness. There is no electric switch to flick, no gaslight humming in the street. If you want light, you must pay for it, literally. In this age, the rhythm of life was bound tightly to the rising and setting of the sun. Candlelight was precious, reserved for work that could not wait, for prayer, for study, or for the wealthy who could afford to stretch their days a little longer. For the poor, nightfall meant the end of activity. Families gathered in dim rooms, conversations hushed in the flicker of a single flame. And then came a law that made the dark even darker. The candle duty, a tax on light itself. In 1709, under the reign of Queen Anne, Parliament introduced the candle duty as part of a broader wave of excise taxes. England was embroiled in costly wars on the continent, and the government was hungry for revenue. Candles, being essential and universally used, were an irresistible target. The tax was applied to the manufacture and sale of candles. To make or sell candles without a license was a crime punishable by fines. Even making candles at home, once a common domestic chore, was outlawed unless you paid for a government license. For the poor, who relied on tallow candles made from animal fat, this law struck hard. What little light they had now came at a higher price. To understand the impact, you must picture just how vital candles were. In a world before electricity, candles were more than ambience. They were the difference between productivity and idleness, safety and fear. In homes, candles lit meals, bedtime prayers, and evening chores. In workshops, They extended hours for weavers, cobblers, and spinners. In schools and monasteries, they allowed for study and scripture reading. In cities, they illuminated inns, taverns, and gatherings. Without candles, darkness ruled. Work stopped, study ended, and the long nights of winter became heavier. The candle duty, then, was not just an economic policy. It was a tax on time itself. Wealthy households could afford beeswax candles, which burned longer and cleaner than tallow. The poor, however, relied on cheaper tallow candles that smoked and smelled, their light dim but sufficient. The tax increased the cost of these humble lights, forcing families to ration their use. Many burned only a single candle in the evening, if any at all. Some relied on rushlights, strips of rush plants dipped in fat, that burned quickly and unevenly but provided a little glow. Others simply surrendered to darkness. The result was a widening gulf between the illuminated lives of the wealthy and the shadowed evenings of the poor. The candle duty had an unintended consequence. It reinforced the old pattern of segmented sleep. Before artificial lighting was widespread, people often slept in 2 shifts. First sleep shortly after dusk, followed by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Then second sleep until dawn. During the wakeful hours, families might pray, talk, or even visit neighbors. But with the tax making candles more expensive, these activities dwindled. Nighttime grew quieter, darker, and more constrained. The government had taxed not just wax and tallow, but the very shape of people's nights. As with many unpopular taxes, resistance brewed. Some continued to make candles illegally, melting tallow in secret and avoiding inspectors. Smuggling of candles became a minor but notable crime. Pamphlets and ballads mocked the absurdity of taxing light itself. Critics argued that the poor were being punished for trying to see in the dark, while the wealthy barely felt the burden. It was yet another reminder of how policy shaped daily life in ways small but deeply felt. And yet, the question remained, what lasting effects did the strange tax have on society, and how did it shape the way people thought about light work and even sleep itself? The candle duty forced families to think differently about light. Candles, once made at home in large batches, became scarce commodities that had to be rationed. Families counted their hours of light as carefully as they counted their coins. In the cottages of the poor, evenings were shortened. Chores that might once have been done by candlelight, mending clothes, spinning wool, reading scripture, were abandoned or squeezed into daylight hours. Families gathered close together around a single wick, squinting at their work in the dim flame. For the middle classes, the duty was frustrating but manageable. They could afford a few candles each night, though many complained of the smoky tallow smell filling their homes. The wealthy, of course, continued to enjoy beeswax candles, chandeliers glittering in their halls as though the tax were an inconvenience rather than a hardship. Thus, the duty drew an invisible line across society, the illuminated and the shadowed. For many households, the rushlight became the answer. A rushlight was a simple device, strips of rush plants peeled, dried, and dipped in animal fat. They burned unevenly, sputtering and smoking, but they were cheaper than tax candles. In villages, children might be sent to gather rushes from marshy fields, while mothers rendered fat from the kitchen to dip them. A rushlight might last half an hour, barely enough for an evening prayer or a quick chore. Families often lit several in succession, their short flames a compromise in a world where true candles were too costly. The rushlight was a reminder of ingenuity under pressure, but also of poverty. It signaled not progress, but adaptation to scarcity. Wherever there's a tax, there's smuggling. Candles were no exception. Some families continued to make tallow candles secretly, hiding them from inspectors. Others bought from neighbors who ignored the law. Inns and taverns often purchased smuggled candles to keep their halls lit without paying the official price. The government tried to enforce the law with licenses and inspections, but the task was nearly impossible. Candles were small, portable, and easy to hide. Inspectors could not be everywhere, and the temptation to bribe them was high. For the poor, smuggling was less a crime than survival. For the authorities, it was yet another example of how excise taxes bred resistance and contempt for government control. One of the subtler effects of the candle duty was its impact on social life. Evening gatherings, which required several candles, became less common among the lower classes. Taverns, inns, and theaters faced higher costs for lighting, which they passed on to customers. The poor, already reluctant to spend money on ale or entertainment, now found nightlife even less accessible. In cities, the streets remained dark. Without affordable lighting indoors, few ventured outside after dusk unless necessary. The darkness deepened divides not only of class, but also of gender and safety. Women in particular faced greater risks traveling in unlit alleys and roads. The candle duty had taxed more than wax. It had taxed laughter, conversation, and the fragile thread of community that stretched through the night hours. Critics of the candle duty did not mince words. Pamphlets mocked the absurdity of taxing something so essential as light. Satirists compared it to taxing air or water. Political opponents of the government pointed to the duty as evidence of tyranny. Even the poor man's candle, the flame by which he teaches his child or reads his Bible, is taken from him by the crown. These arguments were not only about economics, but about dignity. Light was not a luxury. It was part of life. To make it more scarce was to make life smaller. Perhaps the most curious effect was how the duty shaped people's sleep. With fewer candles, evenings grew shorter. Families went to bed earlier, waking again after a few hours in the pattern of first sleep and second sleep. The wakeful hours between, once filled with quiet conversation or reading, now often pass in darkness. Some prayed silently, others dozed, and some simply lay awake, their thoughts drifting. The candle duty reinforced the natural rhythms of segmented sleep, binding households even more tightly to the rise and fall of the sun. It was, in a sense, a tax on wakefulness itself. The candle duty, though deeply unpopular, revealed something profound. How dependent human society is on light. We take it for granted when switches glow at a touch. But in the 18th century, the cost of a single candle could alter the way a family worked, socialized, or prayed. The tax made visible what had always been true. Light is power. And when governments control it, they control time, productivity, and even dreams. But the question lingers. How long could such a tax endure before resentment boiled over, and what finally brought the candle duty to an end? By the mid-18th century, the candle duty had become one of the most disliked excise taxes in England. It was resented not only because it cost money, but because it struck at something intimate, the privacy of the home. Unlike taxes on land or trade, this one crept into bedrooms, kitchens, and workshops. It dictated how many hours a family might read, work, or sit together after dark. For the poor, it was yet another burden in lives already narrowed by scarcity. Pamphlets, sermons, and tavern gossip painted it as absurd. A government so desperate for coin that it would reach into the night itself to collect it. Officials struggled to enforce the duty. Inspectors were tasked with ensuring that candle makers were licensed, but the trade was small and scattered. Families continued to make tallow candles in secret. Rural households melted animal fat quietly, producing their own light while avoiding payment. The crown knew this, but chasing every smuggled or homemade candle was impossible. The very nature of the commodity, small, common, easily hidden, made it unpoliceable. As with many unpopular excise duties, enforcement bred contempt. Instead of instilling respect for law, the candle duty became a symbol of government overreach and incompetence. By the late 18th century, new forms of lighting began to appear. Oil lamps grew more common, particularly in urban households. Whale oil, though expensive, burned brighter and longer than tallow candles. Then, in the early 19th century, gas lighting transformed cities. Streets that had once been pitch black now glowed with rows of lamps. For the first time in history, night itself could be colonized by industry and leisure. The candle, while still essential in many homes, no longer held a monopoly on light. And with alternatives growing, the candle duty seemed increasingly archaic. The pressure finally broke in the 1830s. After more than a century of complaints, Parliament repealed the candle duty in 1831. By then, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and the nation's appetite for productivity and progress outpaced the petty revenue of a candle tax. The repeal was greeted with relief, though by that time oil lamps and gas lights were already shifting the culture of illumination. Candles continued to burn in cottages and parlors, but no longer under the shadow of excise collectors. The end of the duty marked more than a fiscal change. It symbolized a growing recognition that light was essential to life, not a commodity to be squeezed for tax. In retrospect, the candle duty seems absurd, like taxing air or water. But for those who lived under it, the duty shaped the texture of daily existence. It darkened evenings, shortened work hours, and deepened divides between rich and poor. When it ended, light felt freer, even before the march of gas and electricity truly conquered the night. Even after repeal, chamber pots of tallow continued to flicker in humble homes, while chandeliers of beeswax shone in the parlors of the wealthy. Gaslight spread first through urban centers, then railways, then industry. But the memory of the tax lingered. Old people told stories of nights cut short, of rushlights sputtering, of secret candle-making in defiance of the crown. It became part of the folklore of taxation, a warning about governments that reach too far into the rhythms of daily life. The candle duty reminds us that history is not just about kings, wars, or inventions. It is about the quiet details of life, how people worked, prayed, and slept. By taxing candles, Parliament had accidentally taxed time itself, reshaping how long evenings lasted and how deep darkness fell. When we flip a light switch today without a thought, we are living in a world unimaginable to those who once rationed a single wick for a night's work. The story of the candle duty is the story of how fragile comfort was in the past. Light was never guaranteed. It came at a cost, flickering the balance between wealth and poverty, law and defiance, shadow and flame. And so we remember, the glow that now floods our cities began with candles, humble, taxed, resented, but vital. Without them, the night would have been endless. Imagine walking into a medieval apothecary shop. The air is thick with the scent of herbs, sage, lavender, rosemary, and the sharp tang of vinegar. Wooden shelves are lined with jars of powders, roots, and strange concoctions. And in the corner, in a glass jar filled with murky water, wriggle the most valuable of creatures, leeches. For centuries, the leech was not just a nuisance in ponds and marshes. It was medicine. From village healers to royal physicians, the practice of bloodletting was one of the most common treatments in history. And leeches, with their steady, painless bite, became the perfect instrument. Medicine before modern science revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. Too much blood? Too much heat? The answer was simple. Remove some blood. Leeches offer precise, almost elegant solution compared to knives and lancets. Instead of a messy cut, a leech could draw blood slowly in controlled amounts. Patients often felt less pain, and physicians could point to the creature itself as proof that treatment was working. The leech was, in a sense, a natural syringe, long before syringes existed. In practice, leeches were used for nearly everything. Fevers, to cool the body by removing excess blood. Headaches, applied to the temples to ease pressure. Skin diseases, placed near sores or swelling to draw out bad humors. Women's health, prescribed for menstrual irregularities or complications in childbirth. Surgery, to prevent blood buildup after operations. They were placed on the skin, usually after being coaxed with a drop of milk or a prick of a needle. Once attached, they could suck several times their weight in blood before dropping off, sated. A patient might endure dozens of leeches in a single treatment, their bodies left dotted with tiny wounds that sometimes bled for hours. Beyond their practical use, leeches carried symbolic weight. They lived in water, emerged silently, and fed invisibly until full. To medieval and early modern minds, this made them mysterious, almost magical. Some believe they possess innate wisdom, drawing only bad blood and leaving the good. Others distrusted them, seeing them as parasites no different from demons that drain life. Yet even the skeptics could not deny their effectiveness in removing blood gently. The dual image of the leech, as healer and as vampire, shaped its place in culture. It was a creature both feared and revered. By the late Middle Ages, demand for leeches was high. Apothecaries stocked jars of them, and physicians carried them in little boxes filled with damp moss. Farmers and villagers collected them from ponds and streams, wading barefoot into water and letting the creatures attach to their legs before plucking them off. Leeches were cheap in the countryside, but in cities, they could fetch good money. As medical schools spread across Europe, the leech trade expanded, turning a swamp nuisance into a commodity of survival. For patients, the sight of leeches was both dreaded and reassuring. To be prescribed leeches meant the doctor had a plan. The discomfort of their bite was outweighed by the hope of recovery. Imagine lying ill with fever, sweat soaking your sheets. A physician arrives, opens a jar, and places 3 or 4 leeches on your arms. You feel the strange tug of their mouths, the slight relief as blood flows, and the reassurance that something, anything, is being done. It may not have cured the illness, but it gave form to treatment. And in an age where medicine was as much ritual as science, that mattered deeply. But here's the lingering question. If leeches were once so essential, how did their trade grow into one of the largest medical industries of the 18th and 19th centuries? And why did it eventually collapse? By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, leeches were no longer a cottage trade of villagers waiting in ponds. They had become a commodity on a massive scale. Physicians across Europe prescribed them for nearly every ailment, and the demand exploded. France, in particular, became the epicenter of the leech craze. French doctors were famous for prescribing leeches by the dozens, sometimes even hundreds, for a single patient. A man suffering from pneumonia might be covered with them from chest to legs. Women with nervous disorders might endure repeated sessions, each requiring jars full of the wriggling creatures. In Paris alone, millions of leeches were used annually. The humble worm-like parasite had become the backbone of modern medicine. The figures are staggering. By the 1830s, it was estimated that France imported as many as 40 million leeches every year. Britain used millions more, supplied by collectors who scoured rivers, marshes, and ponds. Leeches were shipped in barrels, packed with damp moss to keep them alive. Apothecaries displayed them in jars, ready for physicians or desperate patients. For collectors, this trade was a livelihood. Women and children often entered shallow waters barefoot, allowing leeches to cling to their legs before peeling them off and tossing them into buckets. The job was painful, sometimes dangerous, but provided steady income. Leeches did not discriminate between rich and poor. Wealthy patients might hire private physicians, who prescribed regimented courses of dozens of leeches. Their treatments were frequent and elaborate, performed in comfortable surroundings. Poorer patients often purchased leeches directly from apothecaries, applying them at home. Though cheaper than some remedies, they were still a burden on household budgets. The sight of a leech jar on a mantel or bedside table was common across society. In hospitals, whole wards might reek of damp moss and blood, the faint hiss of glass jars being opened echoing through the halls. For physicians, leeches offered a powerful sense of control. Unlike herbs or tonics, their effect was visible and immediate. Blood flowed, patients weakened visibly, and both doctor and patient believed that something significant had been done. In a medical culture obsessed with humors and balance, leeches were the perfect tool. They could be prescribed in precise numbers, applied to specific locations, and observed in action. The doctor's authority was reinforced by the ritual, the tools, and the living creatures themselves. But the craze had consequences. Patients were often bled to exhaustion. One French physician in the 1830s recorded prescribing up to 100 leeches for a single case of inflammation. Repeated courses could leave patients pale, weak, and more vulnerable to infection. Critics began to note that far from healing, excessive bleeding often worsened illness. Yet the momentum of tradition and the profits of the leech trade kept the practice alive. The hunger for leeches was so great that natural supplies began to dwindle. Marshes across Europe were stripped bare. In England, once plentiful leeches became scarce by the mid-19th century, leading to imports from Ireland, Russia, and even as far as Turkey. Collectors spoke of waters once teeming with leeches reduced to emptiness within a few seasons. The ecological toll was profound, though little understood at the time. The leech, once a nuisance of ponds, had become an endangered commodity, its survival tied to the very industry that depended on it. By the 1830s and 1840s, the leech trade had reached its peak. Apothecaries brimmed with jars. Physicians prescribed them by the millions, and the creatures themselves were transported across continents like coins of blood. But doubts were rising. Did they truly heal, or did they merely weaken? Could endless bleeding really restore balance, or was it draining lives instead of saving them? By the mid-19th century, medicine itself was changing. New tools, microscopes, stethoscopes, thermometers, were offering insights that challenged the old humoral theories. Physicians began to realize that illness was not simply an imbalance of fluids, but the result of specific diseases, infections, and physiological processes. As evidence grew, the foundations of bloodletting wavered. Studies suggested that excessive bleeding weakened patients rather than curing them. Survival rates often fell after leech-heavy treatments. What had once seemed elegant and effective was increasingly seen as harmful. The leech, once medicine's symbol of authority, was now its scapegoat. By the 1850s, criticism turned into rejection. Leading physicians across Europe publicly abandoned large-scale bloodletting. Hospitals reduced their orders of leeches, and apothecaries found themselves with jars of unsold stock. The leech trade, once one of the largest medical industries, collapsed within decades. Collectors lost their livelihoods. Farmers who once sold barrels of leeches to city markets saw demand vanish. Importers who had profited from Russian and Turkish supplies watched fortunes dissolve. The creatures themselves, overharvested for years, were left depleted in their natural habitats. Ironically, just as demand waned, populations in the wild were already devastated. Even as their medical use declined, leeches lingered in culture. The word leech became a metaphor for those who drained others, greedy landlords, corrupt officials, even unwanted relatives. What had once been a healer's tool was remembered more as a parasite. Children, told stories of leeches by elders, shuddered at the thought of slimy creatures clinging to their skin. The aura of mystery and revulsion outlived the trade itself. Yet the leech did not vanish entirely. In the 20th century, doctors rediscovered its usefulness, not for balancing humors, but for microsurgery. Leeches secrete hirudin, a natural anticoagulant that prevents blood from clotting. In reconstructive surgery, particularly when reattaching severed fingers or ears, leeches help restore circulation by drawing off pooled blood and keeping vessels open. What was once superstition became science. The leech returned to hospitals, not in jars stacked for fevers, but in specialized containers for delicate operations. The story of the leech is a story of cycles. From swamp nuisance to medical marvel, from trade empire to collapse, from symbol of ignorance to tool of precision surgery. It reveals how medicine evolves, not in straight lines, but in shifts of belief, economy, and evidence. What one generation trusts implicitly, another may discard, and yet another may revive in new form. Picture it. The apothecary's jar, once central to every household, now sitting forgotten in dusty museums. The leeches within no longer symbolize health, but history. And yet, in quiet surgical rooms, their descendants still perform their work, unseen by most of the world. The rise and fall of the leech trade reminds us that medicine is always a balance between tradition and discovery, faith and evidence, cure and harm. And perhaps it also reminds us of something humbler, that even the lowliest creatures, slimy and feared, can shape the destiny of human health. Imagine holding a pinch of salt in your hand. To you, it is almost invisible, something sprinkled on food without thought, sold cheaply in paper packets. But for most of human history, this tiny crystal was treasure. Salt was life. Salt was survival. And salt, more than gold or silver, built and broke empires. Why? Because salt preserves. Before refrigeration, it was the only way to keep meat, fish, or cheese edible for months. A salted ham could survive a winter. A barrel of salted cod could cross the ocean. Without salt, armies starved, sailors perished, and cities withered. Salt was not just seasoning. It was civilization's invisible foundation. Beyond preservation, salt was essential for body itself. Sweat carries it away, and without replenishment, humans falter. Soldiers on campaign, farmers in the fields, miners underground, all needed steady supplies of salt. Ancient texts understood this instinctively. The Bible calls salt a covenant of God. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in part with salt, giving us the word salary. To be worth one's salt was to be worthy of pay. Salt was not optional. It was as necessary as bread or water. The search for salt shaped geography. Wherever it was found, whether as sea salt, mined rock, or brine, settlements grew. China, by 1600 BCE, people were boiling brine to extract salt. Egypt, the Nile's floodplain provided salt that preserved mummies as well as food. Africa, caravans carried slabs of salt across the Sahara, traded ounce for ounce with gold. Europe, salt springs in Austria gave rise to the Hallstatt culture, one of the earliest Iron Age societies. Everywhere, salt was wealth. Cities sprang up around salt mines and vanished when supplies ran dry. Salt did not just shape diets, it shaped maps. The Via Salaria, Rome's salt road, carried salt from the Adriatic to the capital. Along its route, towns flourished. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax, left a legacy of rebellion that simmered for centuries. In Africa, whole cities like Timbuktu rose as trading hubs where salt caravans met gold routes. To follow salt is to follow the pulse of history. Where it flowed, power followed. Where it failed, collapse often lurked. For the peasant in medieval Europe, salt determined the winter table. Cabbages were packed into barrels with brine to become sauerkraut. Pork was salted and hung in smokehouses. Fish were dried and salted, sustaining villages far from the sea. For the wealthy, salt was more than necessity. It was status. Elaborate salt cellars, silver vessels for holding crystals, graced banquet tables. To sit above the salt was to be honored. To sit below it, humbled. In monasteries, strict rules governed salt usage, with allowances for preserving fish during Lent. In cities, guilds controlled salt prices, and disputes over its trade often sparked riots. What makes salt so fascinating is its invisibility. Unlike gold, which dazzles, or spices, which perfume the air, salt is plain. Yet it ruled more tightly than either. Empires taxed it. Armies guarded it. Families counted it. To run out was disaster. To control it was power. By the 17th century, governments across Europe had learned this well. France's gabelle made salt a cornerstone of royal revenue. In England, salt duties fed the treasury. And in India, the British monopoly on salt would, centuries later, provoke Gandhi's famous Salt March. But here the question emerges. How did salt transform from a household necessity into a political weapon, an object so ordinary it could topple kings and spark revolutions? Because salt was essential, it was irresistible to governments. Unlike luxuries such as wine or silk, salt was consumed by every person, every day. Taxing it meant taxing life itself. In medieval France, the infamous gabelle made salt one of the most heavily taxed commodities. Each region had different rates, creating inequalities that bred anger. In some provinces, salt was affordable. In others, it was a crushing burden. Families smuggled it across borders, risking fines or prison. Salt became not just a necessity, but a symbol of injustice. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, hatred of the gabelle flared alongside anger at bread prices. Revolutionaries abolished the tax, only for it to return later under Napoleon. A reminder that states rarely give up easy revenue. Control of salt was a mark of power. The Roman Empire secured its supply through the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, ensuring steady flow to its armies. In China, dynasties maintained monopolies over salt production, making it one of the empire's most lucrative state enterprises. In Africa, caravans carried slabs of Saharan salt on camelback, traded weight for weight with gold. Cities like Timbuktu thrived on this exchange, their prosperity rising from the crystal as much as the metal. In every empire, salt was a hidden backbone. Without it, armies could not march, food could not be stored, and wealth could not be counted. In England, salt duties became particularly heavy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Salt was taxed at multiple points: production, transport, and sale, making it one of the most regulated commodities in the kingdom. Fishermen, who relied on salt to preserve their catch, complained bitterly. Coastal communities smuggled barrels under cover of night, dodging excise officers. Inland, families diluted their brine or rationed their use, straining to stretch every grain. Even after repeal in the 19th century, the memory of the salt duties lingered, remembered as one of the classic burdens of daily life. Salt's political story did not end in Europe. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi chose salt as a symbol of defiance against British rule in India. The colonial government had established a monopoly on salt production, forcing Indians to buy heavily taxed salt from official sources. Gandhi's genius was to target this most ordinary of needs. He led a 240-mile march to the sea, where he picked up a handful of salt crystals and declared resistance. Millions followed his example, breaking the law by making their own salt. The Salt March electrified India and the world. It showed that the simplest act, picking up a pinch of salt, could defy an empire. Throughout history, salt smuggling was both common and celebrated. From French peasants dodging gabelle collectors to English fishermen sneaking untaxed barrels ashore, the salt smuggler became a folk hero. To smuggle salt was not only to evade tax, it was to resist injustice. Ordinary people, by slipping crystals across borders or boiling brine in secret, turned necessity into rebellion. Because salt touched every household, its control revealed social divides. The wealthy could absorb higher prices, but the poor bore the brunt. A bad harvest already meant hunger. A salt tax meant food spoiled faster, winter felt longer, and survival grew harder. To tax salt was to deepen inequality, to place weight on those least able to carry it. And across centuries, that burden sparked anger that sometimes toppled rulers. But this raises a final question. How did the world eventually escape salt's grip? How did an object once more valuable than gold fade into the background of modern life? For thousands of years, salt shaped economies, empires, and daily life. It decided where cities were built, how armies marched, and how food lasted through winter. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its reign as a strategic commodity was ending. The reason was not that humans stopped needing salt. We still cannot live without it. The change came because new technology stripped it of its monopoly over preservation and survival. The invention of mechanical refrigeration in the 19th century was the beginning of salt's decline as a strategic resource. Suddenly, meat and fish could be stored and transported without barrels of brine. Ice houses, then refrigerated ships, reduced dependence on salt. Where once entire fleets carried salted cod across the Atlantic, by the 20th century chilled cargo ships delivered fresh beef from Argentina or lamb from New Zealand. Salt remained in kitchens, but its role as a gatekeeper of food security diminished. Industrial chemistry also reshaped salt's destiny. By the late 19th century, scientists could synthesize preservatives and disinfectants. Canning and pasteurization offered new ways to keep food safe. Salt, once a miracle preserver, became one ingredient among many. Its political and economic grip loosened as alternatives multiplied. Perhaps the most profound change was simply abundance. Industrial mining and large-scale evaporation made salt cheaper and more plentiful than ever before. Vast underground deposits, once unreachable, were tapped by modern drills. Coastal evaporation fields expanded with industrial efficiency. What had once been guarded, rationed, and taxed now poured into markets in endless supply. By the mid-20th century, salt was no longer treasure. It was cheap, ordinary, almost invisible. Yet salt did not vanish into obscurity. Instead, it found new roles. Today, the majority of mined salt is not eaten at all, but used in industry, chemical production, chlorine and caustic soda, essential for plastics and cleaning agents. Road safety, millions of tons spread on icy highways each winter. Water treatment, used in softening and purification. The salt that once graced royal banquets now keeps factories running and cars safe on frozen mornings. Even as its empire faded, salt left deep marks in language and culture. To be worth one's salt, to take with a grain of salt, to be the salt of the earth. Salt remains embedded in our metaphors, a reminder of the centuries when it was the axis of survival. Salt's story is one of transformation, from sacred covenant to household tax, from caravans across the Sahara to Gandhi's march to the sea. It has been both weapon and necessity. And yet, in our kitchens today, it is cheap, plentiful, and barely noticed. The very ordinariness of salt is the measure of its historical triumph. What once ruled empires is now so abundant that we forget its power. The next time you sprinkle a little salt on your food, pause for a moment. That grain once carried armies, bankrolled kings, and fueled revolutions. It built roads, toppled governments, and filled monasteries with barrels of fish. Salt, the ordinary crystal, once ruled the world, and though its empire has faded, its legacy endures in our bodies, our language, and the silent rhythms of history. In the silence of medieval night, while most townsfolk slept, another class of workers stirred. Lanterns flickered, shovels clinked, and carts rumbled softly through the narrow lanes. These were the gong farmers, the men who cleaned the cesspits, latrines, and privies of medieval towns. The word gong comes from an Old English word meaning going, and gong farmer literally meant the one who deals with what is gone. Put plainly, they were the night chevelers of human waste. As unglamorous as it sounds, their work kept cities from choking on their own filth. Without them, wells would foul, diseases would spread faster, and daily life would grind to a halt. In an age before sewers, most households had a cesspit or privy. Beneath a wooden seat or a simple hole, waste accumulated in deep pits lined with stone or brick. At first, these pits could hold years of accumulation, but eventually they filled. What then? You could not simply abandon the house. The pit had to be emptied. That meant someone had to climb down into the darkness, shovel up the layers of filth, and haul it away. That someone was the gong farmer. By law in many English towns, gong farmers worked only at night, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. The reason was simple. No one wanted to see or smell them at work. The streets were quieter, the air cooler, and the shame less obvious. Armed with long shovels, buckets, and ropes, they descended into cesspits, often waist-deep or worse. The air was foul, thick with ammonia and methane. Some workers tied cloths over their mouths. Others simply endured. They shoveled the waste into buckets, hauled it up, and tipped it into carts. From there, it was carried outside city walls, dumped into fields, or sold as fertilizer to farmers. The work was not only disgusting, but dangerous. Cesspits could collapse, suffocating workers beneath walls of waste. Methane gas could ignite if a lantern was carried too low, and prolonged exposure to filth bred disease. Yet gong farmers persisted. The pay, while modest, was better than many other menial trades. And as long as people ate, slept, and lived in cities, there was always work. Despite their necessity, gong farmers lived under a shadow of stigma. They were considered unclean, often forced to live on the outskirts of towns. Few wished to associate with them, and marriage prospects were slim. Children mocked them. Neighbors shunned them. Yet, ironically, their work touched every household. Every privy depended on their labor. It was a paradox of medieval life. The very people who kept society functional were treated as outcasts. Imagine the scene. The city slumbers under the moonlight. A lantern sways, a cart creaks, and somewhere in the darkness, a gong farmer wipes sweat from his brow as he shovels another load. The smell is overwhelming. The pay is steady. And by dawn, the waste of an entire town will be gone. Quietly, invisibly, anonymously. Without him, the streets would drown in filth. With him, life goes on. But this raises the next question. How did gong farmers fit into the wider economy of waste? Selling what they collected, dealing with city laws, and facing the consequences of their labor? To modern minds, human waste is only a nuisance. But in the medieval world, it had value. What gong farmers hauled out of cesspits was not always dumped. It was often sold. Farmers used it as night soil, spreading it on their fields to enrich crops. Human waste, mixed with straw and animal dung, was a powerful fertilizer. Cities without gong farmers would drown in filth, while fields without their product would starve. Thus, the gong farmer stood at the strange intersection of sanitation and agriculture, turning waste into wealth. Once the cesspits were emptied, the waste was loaded into carts and carried beyond the walls. There, it was dumped in designated pits or spread directly onto farmland. Some cities established contracts with farmers, who paid for regular deliveries. This night soil trade, was an early recycling system. The city rid itself of its burden, and the countryside received nutrients that sustained crops. In a time when artificial fertilizers did not exist, this cycle was essential, but it came with problems. Crops fertilized with untreated waste could spread disease, contaminating food supplies. Though no one understood germs, people noticed that illness often followed the spreading of fresh night soil. Still, hunger outweighed hesitation. Because their work was so unpleasant, Gong farmers were often better paid than other laborers. Records suggest that in Tudor England, they could earn up to 6 pence a day, a solid wage for unskilled work. Some were employed directly by towns. Others contracted privately by wealthy households. Still, their earnings came with heavy costs, ruined health, foul reputations, and shortened lives. Few Gong farmers grew old. Cities recognized both the necessity and the risks of the trade. Regulations sprang up. Gong farmers could only work at night, to spare citizens a sight and smell. Waste had to be carted outside city walls, never dumped near wells or rivers. Fines were levied against those who disposed of waste improperly. In London, ordinances carefully controlled where Gong farmers could dump loads, and inspectors were assigned to ensure compliance. Even so, complaints were constant. Neighbors protested when dumping grounds grew too close. Farmers quarreled over prices. Officials worried about disease. The Gong farmer, though despised, was always on the city's mind. Not all waste followed the rules. Some Gong farmers, eager to save effort, dumped loads in alleys or streams under cover of darkness. Others bribed inspectors to look away. The temptation to cut corners was strong. After all, hauling heavy carts beyond the walls was exhausting work. These shortcuts led to scandals. Outbreaks of disease were sometimes traced in nearby dumping. In response, laws tightened, but enforcement was never perfect. The balance between necessity and negligence defined the trade. There was also a class divide in sanitation. Wealthy households often had larger, deeper cesspits, and they could afford regular cleanings. Their waste was removed discreetly. Their homes kept relatively clean. The poor, by contrast, often shared shallow pits that overflowed. When Gong farmers did clean them, it was less frequent, and the waste sometimes lingered nearby. Thus, sanitation mirrored the broader inequalities of medieval society. For all their economic importance, Gong farmers remained invisible. Their names rarely appear in records except in fines or contracts. They lived at the margins, both literally and socially. To invite one into conversation was shameful. To marry into their families was unthinkable. And yet, every city depended on them. Without Gong farmers, cesspits would overflow, streets would reek even worse than they already did, and disease would spread unchecked. They were the silent, hidden hands of urban survival. But the question remains, what became of the Gong farmer as cities changed? Did they disappear with the coming of sewers? Or did their work evolve into new forms of sanitation? For centuries, the Gong farmer was a fixture of city life. By lantern light, they scraped and shoveled, keeping cesspits from spilling into homes and streets. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, their world began to change. The rise of population, industry, and new technology created pressures that the old system of cesspits and night soil could not manage. The humble Gong farmer, once indispensable, was slowly swept aside by pipes, drains, and sewers. As towns grew into cities, cesspits became unmanageable. In London, by the 1600s, some pits overflowed directly into basements. The stench of waste mixed with the smoke of coal fires, choking neighborhoods. Disease was rampant. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera found fertile ground and water tainted by cesspits. The work of the Gong farmer, while heroic in its necessity, was never enough. They could empty pits, but not transform the growing tide of waste. Cities needed a larger solution. That solution came with the development of underground sewer systems. Slowly at first, then rapidly in the 18th and 19th centuries, European cities began to dig vast tunnels to carry waste away with flowing water. London, the Great Stink of 1858 forced Parliament to act. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette built miles of sewers that finally carried the city's waste safely to the Thames estuary. Paris, Baron Haussmann's grand redesign of the city included sewers that became as famous as its boulevards. Other cities, across Europe and beyond, the model spread, water, not men with shovels, would now carry waste away. The gong farmer, once the only line of defense, was rendered obsolete. The disappearance of gong farmers did not mean the disappearance of dirty work. Their role evolved. The new world of pipes and sewers required maintenance, inspection, and repair. Men climbed into tunnels to clear blockages, clean out deposits, and keep water flowing. The stigma remained. Sewer workers were still considered unclean, still forced to labor in darkness. But unlike gong farmers, they were backed by city governments, employed in large numbers, and protected by laws that recognized sanitation as a public good. In a sense, modern sanitation workers are the heirs of gong farmers. Less despised, more professionalized, but still guardians of the unseen. Few names of gong farmers survive. They were not celebrated in chronicles, rarely mentioned except in ordinances or fines. Their anonymity was part of their burden. Yet, without them, medieval life would have collapsed under its own weight. They were as essential as bakers or blacksmiths, even if they lived in shadows. Their work made urban life possible long before engineers built sewers. The story of the gong farmer is one of necessity, invisibility, and transformation. It reminds us that history is not only about kings or battles, but about the people who did the work no one else would. They endured foul air, collapsing pits, and social disdain, all to keep cities habitable. And though their profession disappeared, their legacy lives on every time a flush carries waste away unnoticed. Tonight, when you turn on a tap or hear the rush of a flush, think back to the lantern-lit nights when men with shovels labored waist-deep in cesspits. The gong farmer may be forgotten, but his work laid the foundation for the cleanliness of our modern world. History is not only written in shining palaces, it is also written in the shadows, where even the foulest labor kept humanity alive. Imagine waking up in a world without clocks. No alarm buzzing, no watch on your wrist, no church tower striking the hour. Instead, time flows with the rhythm of sun, moon, and season. People rise with dawn, labor through daylight, and rest with the coming of night. This was the reality for most of human history. Mechanical clocks are a relatively recent invention. Before them, humans measured time by the most obvious markers: shadows, candles, water, and sand. These tools shaped not only daily life, but also the very way people thought about the passing of hours. To medieval peasants, time was not divided into precise hours and minutes. It was measured in rhythms of necessity. Work until the dew dries. Rest when the sun is highest. Gather when the bell rings for prayer. Days stretched or shrank with the seasons. In winter, nights were long and work days short. In summer, fields demanded labor from dawn until twilight. Precision was irrelevant. Survival was the only measure. Even language reflects this fluidity. Words like matins, lauds, vespers, and compline, the canonical hours of prayer, gave structure not by numbers but by moments of the day. The simplest tool for marking time was a shadow, a stick thrust into the earth, or a more refined sundial carved in stone, showed the passing of hours as the sun moved. But sundials had limits. They worked only in clear weather and only during the day. In northern Europe, long winters and cloudy skies made them unreliable. For nighttime or cloudy days, other solutions were needed. In monasteries, where prayers had to be said at specific intervals, monks relied on water clocks, vessels that dripped steadily, marking the passage of time. The level of water indicated when it was time to rise, chant, or pray. Candle clocks offered another method. A candle, marked with lines, burned at a predictable rate. By watching its length diminish, one could measure the passing of hours. Some even embedded nails in the wax. As the candle burned, the nails fell with a clink, signaling the passage of time. Though crude, these tools gave structure to nights otherwise swallowed by darkness. By the 14th century, the hourglass became a favorite instrument. Sand trickled at a steady pace through a narrow neck, measuring minutes or hours. Unlike water clocks, it did not freeze in winter, and unlike sundials, it worked indoors. Hourglasses guided sailors on long voyages, monks in their prayers, and merchants in their trades. To turn the glass was to reset time itself, a small gesture that gave order to an otherwise fluid world. Perhaps the most important markers of time were not objects at all, but bells. Church bells rang for mass, work, meals, and curfews. They synchronized entire communities, telling farmers when to begin, merchants when to close, and townsfolk when to lock their gates. In this sense, time was communal rather than personal. You did not carry a watch. You listened for the bell. The sound of iron striking through the air was as binding as any written schedule. To live before clocks was to live in elastic time. Tasks stretched until they were done. Meetings happened when people arrived. No one demanded punctuality in the modern sense. A neighbor who said he would come in the morning might appear any time between dawn and noon. This flexibility suited a world where survival depended more on weather and harvest than on the precision of minutes. Time was lived, not counted. But here's the question. How did societies shift from this loose, rhythm-based life to the rigid tick-tock precision of hours and minutes? And what role did hourglasses, bells, and eventually mechanical clocks play in that transformation? For centuries, loose time was enough. Farmers followed the sun, monks prayed by bells, and merchants opened their stalls when the streets grew busy. But by the late Middle Ages, life was changing. Trade, markets grew busier, and contracts required punctual meetings. Religion, monasteries demanded strict schedules of prayer, impossible without reliable markers. Cities, as towns swelled, coordinating daily rhythms required more than guesswork. The need for precision pressed against the limits of sundials, candles, and water clocks. A new solution was waiting: the mechanical clock. The first mechanical clocks appeared in European monasteries in the 13th century. Instead of relying on dripping water or burning wax, these devices used gears and weights. Weights pulled ropes that turned wheels. Escapements regulated motion, ensuring gears moved at steady intervals. Bells rang at set times, summoning monks to prayer. Though crude, these early clocks transformed time. They did not just measure it, they announced it. A bell ringing from a tower told everyone within earshot that a new hour had begun. By the 14th century, clock towers spread across Europe, from Milan to London. Each became a civic symbol. A town that could afford a clock proclaimed its wealth, order, and modernity. With mechanical clocks came new authority. Town councils set the bells, and in doing so, they set the rhythm of daily life. Merchants opened and closed by the bell. Courts began at appointed hours. Workers' days lengthened or shortened according to official chimes. Time was no longer entirely natural. It was becoming political. The bell became more than a sound. It was a command, and the clock tower, looming over markets and churches, reminded citizens that their hours now belonged not just to the sun, but to the city itself. The spread of clocks began to reshape labor. Farmers still followed daylight, but artisans and apprentices in towns were increasingly bound to scheduled hours. Work from sunrise until the 9th hour slowly shifted into work until the bell strikes. This discipline intensified with the coming of industry. But even in the medieval and early modern periods, the shift had begun. Time was no longer elastic. It was tightening, becoming a resource to be measured, divided, and sold. While towns rang bells, sailors turned hourglasses. At sea, sundials were useless and bells too easily drowned by waves. The hourglass became the navigator's tool. Ship crews turned glasses every half hour, marking the passage of watches, the shifts of sailors' duties. Combined with log lines thrown overboard to measure speed, these glasses helped sailors estimate distance traveled. Without them, voyages across oceans would have been impossible. The steady trickle of sand was, in a way, the heartbeat of exploration. In universities and monasteries, clocks changed scholarship too. Classes began at fixed times. Disputations were measured, and libraries enforced strict opening and closing. Scholars began to think not only in terms of days or seasons, but in hours. Astronomers especially relied on accurate timekeeping to chart the heavens. The clocks ticked parallel the movement of stars, tightening the bond between earth and sky. Perhaps the greatest change was psychological. Before clocks, time was experienced as flow, loose, shifting, responsive to the natural world. After clocks, time became a series of units: hours, minutes, moments that could be counted and lost. People began to speak of wasting time, saving time, or keeping time. The clock turned an experience into a commodity. And once the mind learned to hear the tick, it never forgot it. But this raises a final question. What happened when mechanical clocks became ubiquitous? How did society adapt when time itself became rigid? And how did this reshape everything from sleep to work to the very sense of being human? By the 15th and 16th centuries, mechanical clocks had spread from monasteries to town squares across Europe. Bells rang in every city, marking hours not by the shifting sun, but by the steady tick of gears. Time had become public property. No longer did each household live by its own rhythm of dawn and dusk. The entire community moved together, bound by the same chimes echoing from towers. A new question arose. What does it mean to live by the same hours as everyone else? The clock introduced discipline into labor. Artisans in guild halls, apprentices in workshops, and later factory workers were no longer measured by how much daylight they used, but by how many hours they worked. Punctuality became a virtue. To be late was no longer a minor inconvenience. It was a failure of character. Employers expected obedience to clock, and the very concept of the working day was born. This shift marked the beginning of modern labor. Time as money, the hour as a wage, the day as a schedule. Before mechanical time, people often slept in two shifts. First sleep after dusk, then a wakeful period around midnight, followed by second sleep until dawn. These rhythms suited a life guided by natural light and flexible hours. But as clocks imposed stricter schedules, early rising for markets, fixed times for work, segmented sleep began to vanish. People compressed their rest into a single block, aligning themselves with the rigid hours of the clock. Even dreams changed, condensed into shorter nights. The mind adapted to the tick of gears. Control of clocks meant control of life. Churches rang bells for prayer. Town councils rang them for curfews. Armies marched by drum and bell. The authority to declare an hour became political power. To live in a city meant surrendering to its schedule. The bell told you when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. It was no longer just a marker of time, but a command that shaped obedience. By the 17th and 18th centuries, smaller domestic clocks spread to wealthy households. The pendulum, invented in the mid-1600s, increased accuracy dramatically. For the first time, families could mark hours at home without relying on public bells. The home became a microcosm of the clock-regulated world. Meals, prayers, chores, all were ordered by the steady tick of pendulums. Time had moved from the tower to the hearth. Perhaps the most profound legacy of mechanical time is psychological. Once clocks divided life into hours and minutes, people internalized the rhythm. Even without hearing a bell, we feel the pressure of the hourglass. We speak of wasting time, running out of time, or buying time. The clock made time measurable, and once measurable, it became something that could be lost. This mental shift separated modern humans from their ancestors. No longer guided by the sky, we became guided by gears. The story of time before clocks reminds us how radically our perception of life can change. To live by shadows and bells was to live in flow, elastic and communal. To live by mechanical clocks was to live in units, rigid and personal. The hourglass, the candle, the sundial, all gave way to gears and pendulums. And with that change, human history itself took on a new rhythm. Faster, stricter, unrelenting. Tonight, as you glance at a glowing screen that tells you the precise second, imagine instead a candle burning slowly in the dark, or a monk listening for the drip of water in a quiet cloister. That was time once. Fragile, fluid, lived in rhythm with the earth. And yet, from that fragile past came the relentless precision we know today. The tick of the clock is not eternal. It was invented. And before it, time was something softer, something human. Imagine a hot summer's day in the year 1820. The air is heavy, crops wilt in the fields, and workers wipe sweat from their brows. In the kitchen, milk sours, butter softens, and meat threatens to rot. There are no humming refrigerators, no humming freezers. Yet, in the cellar of a wealthy household, the family enjoys chilled drinks and preserved food. How? Because of a trade that captured winter itself. the harvesting of ice. Long before refrigeration, ice was a luxury, a commodity, and for some, a livelihood. Across Europe and America, men braved the cold each winter to cut blocks of frozen water from lakes and rivers, storing them for the hot months ahead. To us, ice seems ordinary. To past generations, it was treasure. Preserved in insulated ice houses, a winter's harvest could last through summer. It kept butter firm, fish fresh, and drinks refreshingly cold. Kings and aristocrats flaunted their ice supplies, serving chilled wine or ice desserts at feasts. In Paris and London, fashionable households prided themselves on frozen delicacies. By the 19th century, the craving for ice spread beyond elites. Taverns, fishmongers, and even hospitals sought it. Ice was no longer just a novelty. It was a necessity of modernizing life. The harvest began when lakes froze thick enough to bear men and horses. Teams of workers ventured out onto the ice, bundled in wool, their breath clouding in the air. Marking the grid, using long-handled saws or horse-drawn cutters, workers scored the surface into neat squares. Sawing and splitting, men sawed to the frozen sheet, releasing great blocks. Hauling ashore, the blocks, often weighing hundreds of pounds, were dragged ashore with hooks and sledges. Loading and transport. From there, the ice was stacked into wagons, carried to ice houses, and packed tightly in sawdust for insulation. The work was brutal. Cold seeped through boots, wind cut across open lakes, and accidents were common. Men fell into icy water. Horses broke through thin spots, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Yet each block was profit, each load survival. Storage was as important as harvesting. Across Europe, estates and cities built ice houses, deep pits lined with stone or brick, often roofed with earth. Packed with sawdust or straw, these vaults could hold ice for months, sometimes over a year. Wealthy households built private ice houses in gardens or estates. In America, farmers pooled resources for communal stores. Cities constructed massive depots to supply markets and hospitals. The ice house was, in a sense, the refrigerator of its time, silent, earthy, and dependent on the labor of winter. For most of history, ice remained a luxury. Poor families could not afford ice houses or purchase blocks. Their food spoiled quickly in summer, diets shifting toward what could be dried, salted, or smoked. But for the rich, ice symbolized refinement. Chilled wine at a banquet or dessert frozen cream became status markers. In some courts, guests marveled at snow-cooled drinks in midsummer, not knowing the immense labor hidden behind each frosty sip. By the late 18th century, ice was more than a household novelty. It was an industry. Entrepreneurs saw a profit in supplying cities with harvested ice. Barges carried it down rivers. Wagons delivered it to markets. Ice became a traded commodity, with prices rising in hot summers and falling in cold winters. Still, its reach was limited by distance. Without reliable insulation, ice melted on long journeys. That was about to change, however, and the ice trade would leap from local ponds to global oceans. But the question remains, how did ice leap from local lakes into a worldwide business, shipped across oceans and turning winter itself into an international trade? By the early 19th century, ice harvesting had transformed from a local chore into an international industry. What began as villagers cutting blocks of their own ice houses soon became fleets of ships carrying frozen cargoes across oceans. The man most often credited with launching the global ice trade was Frederick Tudor of Boston, remembered as the Ice King. In 1806, Tudor loaded a brig with blocks of New England ice and shipped it to the Caribbean. Locals laughed. Why would anyone pay for frozen water bound to melt? But with clever insulation, sawdust, wood shavings, and straw, much of the ice survived the voyage. By the time it arrived in Martinique, it sold at a premium. From that experiment, an empire was born. Within decades, New England ice was being shipped not only to the Caribbean, but to India, China, and South America. In Calcutta, British colonials marveled at glasses of chilled punch in the sweltering heat. In Havana, blocks of ice preserved fish and cooled wealthy households. Even in Hong Kong and Singapore, ships brought the frozen harvest of American ponds. Europe had its own trade as well. Norway exported ice across the North Sea to Britain, where it supplied fishmongers, hospitals, and breweries. Ice houses in London brimmed with blocks from fjords thousands of miles away. Ice, once a fleeting luxury of winter, became a global commodity. Entrepreneurs like Tudor grew rich. They built vast ice houses on Boston's waterfront, capable of holding tens of thousands of tons. Barges carried ice from New England ponds to waiting ships, each load insulated in sawdust and tarpaulins. Workers labored through brutal winters, cutting geometric grids into frozen lakes, driving horse-drawn cutters across the surface, and loading block after block. The work was seasonal but immense. A single large pond could supply the Caribbean or India for a summer. By mid-century, the trade was so vast that New England alone exported more than 150,000 tons of ice a year. The arrival of ice transformed urban life. In New York, Boston, and London, icemen became familiar figures, delivering blocks to households much like milkmen. Families stored ice in insulated chests, keeping butter cool and milk fresh. Taverns advertised ice drinks. Hospitals used it to treat fever patients, and butchers kept meat longer without spoilage. The middle classes, once excluded from luxury, now tasted ice in daily life. For a penny or two, city dwellers could enjoy chilled lemonade on a summer's day. The key to the trade was not just harvesting, but preserving. Sawdust from lumber mills, once a waste product, became invaluable. Packed tightly around ice blocks, it slowed melting dramatically. Ice houses in tropical ports were built with thick walls, double roofs, and air gaps to keep heat at bay. A well-built ice house in India could hold its cargo for months, even in blazing summer. This technology turned impossible, shipping frozen water across oceans, into a routine part of commerce. Ice reshaped culture. Summer no longer meant spoiled food and tepid drinks. It meant ice cream, lemonade, and fresh seafood. In America, the invention of the ice cream parlor coincided with a boom in ice delivery. In Britain, fishmongers expanded their reach, keeping cod fresh far from the sea. Even medicine changed. Surgeons used ice to numb wounds, while hospitals kept fevers down with cold compresses. For the first time, people experienced the cooling comfort of ice as a form of healing. Yet, even as the ice trade boomed, its limits were clear. Harvest depended on cold winters. A mild season could ruin supplies. Demand was rising faster than nature could provide. And a new rival was waiting in the wings: mechanical refrigeration. By the late 19th century, ice was no longer just harvested. It was manufactured. Machines could freeze water in controlled conditions, producing a steady supply year-round. The global ice trade, once an empire, faced its slow decline. But the question lingers: how did the rise of artificial refrigeration finally end the age of ice harvesting, and what traces of this frozen industry remain today? By the late 19th century, the very success of the ice trade sowed the seeds of its downfall. Demand was skyrocketing. Cities grew, diets diversified, and people wanted ice year-round, not just when winter allowed. But nature could not always keep pace. A mild season could mean shortages, skyrocketing prices, and spoiled goods. Enter mechanical refrigeration. Inventors developed machines that compress gases to absorb and release heat, creating steady cold. At first, these machines were large and costly, used mainly in breweries and meatpacking plants. But as technology improved, refrigeration spread into warehouses, ships, and eventually homes. For the first time in history, humanity could create winter on demand. The impact on the ice trade was swift and brutal. By the early 20th century, shipments of natural ice declined as factories produced artificial ice in bulk. Why risk a voyage from Boston to Bombay or depend on the freeze of a New England pond, when machines could churn out tons of ice regardless of season? Frederick Tudor, the original Ice King, had died wealthy, but his successors saw their empire shrink. Norwegian ice exports dwindled as British breweries switched to machine-made supplies. American icemen, once as common as milkmen, began to vanish from city streets. By the 1930s, natural ice harvesting had largely disappeared in industrial nations, replaced by mechanical cold. Yet the tradition lingered in some places. Rural communities without access to electricity continued to harvest ice from lakes well into the mid-20th century. Families packed blocks in sawdust and stored them in wooden sheds, keeping food cool through summer. Even today, in a few regions, ice is still cut for cultural heritage or tourist demonstrations. Horses pull sledges across frozen lakes. Men wield long saws, and visitors marvel at the labor once considered ordinary. The forgotten art is remembered in reenactments, museums, and the stories of those who lived through its last days. Though the trade itself died, its influence shaped modern life in profound ways. Food distribution. Without the ice trade, global fisheries and long-distance meat supply would not have developed. It laid the foundation for today's cold chains. Urban life. The daily delivery of ice-accustomed households to refrigeration, smoothing the path for electric fridges. Culture. Ice cream parlors, chill drinks, and cold desserts all became staples of summer because of the ice harvest. Language. Phrases like breaking the ice remind us of a time when cutting ice was literal labor. The forgotten art of ice harvesting shows how fragile civilization can be. For a century, millions of tons of frozen water moved across oceans, sustaining cities and shaping diets. Then, within a few decades, it was gone, replaced by humming machines we scarcely notice today. It is a reminder that even the mightiest industries can melt away, leaving behind only faint traces in memory and culture. The next time you open a refrigerator, pause to imagine the men on frozen lakes, swinging saws in the biting wind, hauling blocks with horses, packing them in sawdust, and sending them across the world. What you take for granted, an ice cube in a glass, was once treasure harvested from the heart of winter. Today, shoes are so ordinary we barely think about them. They line shop windows, pile up in closets, and can be bought for a day's wages, or less. But for much of history, shoes were precious possessions, carefully made, worn until collapse, and repaired again and again. In fact, there were times when a good pair of shoes could cost more than a family's yearly rent. To own sturdy footwear was not a fashion statement. It was survival, wealth, and sometimes status. Shoes required skilled labor and expensive materials. Leather, the main component, came from cattle hides. But hides were scarce, as most livestock were slaughtered only when old or sick. Tanners then had to soak, lime, scrape, and treat hides in a long, foul-smelling process that demanded space and skill. Once tanned, the leather passed into the hands of cordwainers, shoemakers. Every pair was made by hand, measured, cut, stitched, and fitted. A well-made shoe could take days to complete. This meant shoes were not disposable items. They were investments. Families saved to buy them, and when they did, they expected them to last for years. Because of the high price, many peasants and laborers went without shoes altogether, especially in summer. Travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries frequently remarked on barefoot farmers and children. Shoes were saved for Sundays, church services, or winter's cold. A poor man might own a single pair for years, patched and resoled until the leather thinned to nothing. Women often made do with clogs, wooden soles strapped with leather, or simply went barefoot in fields and markets. Shoes were a visible marker of poverty or prosperity. To walk shod was to be respected. To walk barefoot was to be seen as lowly. For the wealthy, shoes became symbols of rank. Nobles wore fine leather dyed in bright colors, sometimes decorated with embroidery, buckles, or silk. In Renaissance courts, fashion dictated the shape of toes, long and pointed in one era, wide and square in another. But these shoes were not built for work. They were built for show. They contrasted sharply with the heavy, practical boots of soldiers or laborers, which represented toil and survival. Thus, shoes divided society: the costly finery of the elite, the practical leather of the middling sort, and the bare feet of the poor. Records show that in parts of medieval and early modern Europe, a pair of sturdy boots could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a laborer. In some cases, shoemakers demanded more than tenants paid yearly for small cottages. This imbalance reflected the sheer difficulty of producing durable footwear. A house could be built from timber and clay with family labor, but shoes required leather, a scarce, processed material controlled by guilds and tradesmen. It was no exaggeration to say that, for many, a house was easier to acquire than a pair of reliable shoes. Shoes carried more than feet. They carried meaning. To be without them was shame. To own them was pride. To wear them out was a story of labor written into leather. Every step scuffed, patched, or stitched was a reminder of cost and necessity. Shoes were not fashion, but the very ground of survival. But this raises the next question. How did people stretch the life of something so costly? What practices of repair, reuse, and ingenuity kept shoes walking for years beyond their prime? A pair of shoes was not something you bought and forgot. It was the beginning of a long relationship. Patches, stitches, and repairs stretched their lives far beyond what we'd imagine today. Shoes cycled between cordwainers who made new shoes and cobblers who repaired them. While guild rules often kept the two trades separate, in practice, cobblers were essential to ordinary people. They stitched torn seams, patched holes with scraps of leather, and most importantly, replaced worn soles. A shoe might be resoled half a dozen times before finally giving up. Some were cut down into smaller shoes for children, ensuring no piece of leather went to waste. Shoes were precious enough to pass through generations. Children inherited their parents' worn pairs, their small feet stuffed with rags or straw until they grew. Older siblings' shoes were passed down until nothing remained but tattered scraps. In poorer families, shoes were communal. A single pair might be shared between siblings, worn by one child at church while the others went barefoot, then rotated the next week. To have the shoes was almost a privilege. When leather grew thin, households found creative ways to prolong use. Stuffing soles with straw for padding and insulation, nailing on wooden clogs to protect fragile leather bottoms, binding shoes with cloth or rope to hold them together, turning them inside out, and resuing to squeeze out one more season. Every patch told a story of scarcity and persistence. Shoes were never simply worn out. They were lived in until they collapsed into rags. Cobblers occupied a curious social role. Their shops were humble, filled with scraps of leather, piles of old shoes, and the sharp smell of glue. Customers came not for luxury, but for survival. To a poor laborer, a cobbler was indispensable. To the wealthy, he was a last resort. Fine shoes were sent back to cordwainers for delicate repairs. But for the majority, cobblers kept the world walking. Their work was constant. Streets of dirt and stone shredded soles quickly. Farmers tramped through mud. Soldiers marched until boots split, and children scuffed through endless wear. The cobbler's bench was never empty. Despite repairs, many went barefoot much of the year. Feet hardened into tough leather themselves, callous against stone and soil. Children especially grew up shoeless, their soles toughened by play. In some regions, being barefoot carried no shame. It was simply practicality. In others, it marked poverty sharply. To arrive at church without shoes was a visible sign of need. Shoes were often polished and saved for such occasions, while daily labor continued barefoot. Shoes were cared for almost ritually. Waxing leather, drying shoes by the hearth, packing them with straw to hold shape. These were part of household chores. To neglect shoes was to invite ruin. For once gone, they were not easily replaced. Even wills sometimes listed shoes alongside clothes and tools, evidence of their value. To bequeath shoes was to pass on wealth as surely as land or livestock.